The English Reformation was not merely a battle of kings and parliaments, popes and bishops. It was a war fought in whispers and sermons, in marketplaces and prisons, in the fragile bodies of men and women who dared to believe differently. And among the martyrs who fell in this storm of faith and fury, few stand as boldly as Anne Askew. She was a poet, a preacher, a mother, and a dissenter. She was a woman who dared to read the Bible in English, who spoke of faith in her own voice, who refused to be silenced by the guardians of orthodoxy. And for this, she was arrested, interrogated, tortured on the rack, and finally burned alive in Smithfield. Her story is more than the death of one woman. It is the story of a society convulsing under the weight of change, where the fires of heresy burned as brightly as the fires of reform, and where the body of a single woman could become the battlefield for England's soul. The rise of a rebel. To understand the tortured death of Anne Askew, we must begin with her life, a life that unfolded in the very heart of England's religious upheaval. Anne was born in 1521 into a prominent Lincolnshire family. Her father, Sir William Askew, was a wealthy landowner and courtier. She grew up in a world of privilege, but also of strict expectation. As with many women of her station, her fate was meant to be sealed through marriage, her life a tool for cementing alliances between families. Yet Anne was no ordinary daughter. From an early age, she displayed a fierce intellect and an unyielding spirit. While many women of her class were expected to remain silent, Anne devoured the scriptures. The Reformation had brought translations of the Bible into English, and Anne seized upon them with passion. To read the Bible in one's own tongue was, to the Catholic hierarchy, an act of rebellion. But to Anne, it was an act of liberation. Her voice began to emerge, shaped not by the quiet obedience expected of women, but by the fiery certainty of faith. She debated priests, she recited scripture in public, she questioned doctrine. And in this, she crossed a line that many women of her age dared not approach. She claimed authority over truth itself. Anne's life took a fateful turn when she was married, against her will, to Thomas Kyme, a Catholic landowner. The marriage was meant to be between her elder sister and Kyme, but when her sister died, Anne was forced to take her place. From the beginning, the union was a disaster. Kyme was a staunch traditionalist. Anne was a fiery Protestant reformer. Their household became a battleground of belief, a microcosm of England's wider turmoil. Anne refused to conform to the role of submissive wife. She read the Bible openly, preached reformist ideas, and challenged her husband's faith. In the end, the marriage collapsed. Anne was cast out, her children taken from her. But instead of retreating into silence, she moved to London, the restless heart of England's religious conflicts. The London that Anne entered in the 1540s was a city divided by faith. On one hand, King Henry VIII had broken from Rome, declaring himself head of the Church of England. On the other, the machinery of Catholic tradition still gripped the courts, the bishops, and the prisons. Heresy trials filled the streets with whispers, and executions at Smithfield became grim spectacles of fire and smoke. Anne entered this world not as a quiet observer, but as a voice crying out in defiance. She joined circles of Protestant reformers, read the Bible in English, and began to preach publicly. She was tall, striking, and eloquent, and soon drew attention from both followers and enemies. Her presence in London was an act of defiance in itself. A woman preaching scripture was scandalous enough. A woman preaching heresy was intolerable. It did not take long for the authorities to notice. In 1545, Anne was arrested for her Protestant beliefs. She was interrogated by church officials and pressured to recant, but she refused. Her trial records, which she herself helped shape since she wrote about her experiences, reveal a woman of sharp wit and unbreakable will. When asked about the doctrine of the Eucharist, whether the bread and wine truly became the body and blood of Christ, she gave evasive yet cutting answers, refusing to betray her conscience while denying her captors the satisfaction of an easy conviction. At one point, when asked about her beliefs, she retorted, "I believe so much as the Holy Scripture doth purport." It was a masterstroke of rhetoric, for who could condemn belief in Scripture? Yet everyone in the room understood the subtext. She rejected Catholic transubstantiation, affirming instead the Protestant view that Christ was present spiritually, not physically. She was released that first time, perhaps because of her noble background, perhaps because her enemies were not yet ready to make an example of her. But her reprieve was temporary. Anne's freedom did not silence her, it only emboldened her. She continued to preach, continued to debate, continued to write. By 1546, the political winds had shifted again. King Henry VIII, once sympathetic to reformers, grew increasingly authoritarian and suspicious of heresy. Conservative bishops gained influence, and reformers were hunted with greater zeal. Anne was arrested again. This time, the machinery of punishment would not let her go. The interrogations of Anne Askew were not simply about her beliefs, they were about her connections. Authorities suspected she was tied to high-ranking women at court, perhaps even Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's sixth and final wife, known for her reformist leanings. To uncover evidence against such powerful figures, they needed Anne to speak, but Anne refused. She would not betray others, and she would not betray her faith. Her refusal led her to one of the most infamous episodes in English history, her torture on the rack. The rack was an instrument of hell disguised as wood and iron. The victim was bound by wrists and ankles. The wheels were turned. Slowly, deliberately, the body was stretched beyond its limits. Joints cracked, ligaments tore, shoulders and hips dislocated. By law, women of gentle birth were rarely tortured. But Anne Askew was different. Her defiance enraged her captors. Against the law, against custom, she was stretched upon the rack in the Tower of London. Two of her interrogators, Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and Sir Richard Rich, were so determined to break her that they personally turned the wheels when the lieutenant of the Tower refused. Anne's body was shattered. She was left unable to walk, carried to her later trial in a chair. But even broken, she did not break. She gave up no names. She gave up no confession. Her silence was her victory. By June 1546, Anne Askew was condemned to die. Alongside her, three men, Nicholas Shaxton, Nicholas White and John Hadlam, were sentenced to burn. The martyrdom at Smithfield. Anne Askew's last days in 1546 were a descent into fire, but they were also a crescendo of defiance. Broken on the rack, unable to walk, she had every reason to yield. Yet it was in this shattered state that her resolve shone most brightly. If her captors had hoped pain would silence her, they were gravely mistaken. Instead, Anne transformed her suffering into testimony, not only through her words, but through the very manner of her death. From her cell, Anne left behind a record that would become her legacy, the Examinations of Anne Askew. These writings, smuggled out of prison, were published after her death by reformist allies. They remain among the most extraordinary first-person accounts of religious persecution in Tudor England. In them, she recounts her interrogations with calm precision, sometimes with a flash of biting wit. When asked by officials if she accepted the doctrine of transubstantiation, that the bread and wine became the literal body and blood of Christ, she replied with measured scorn, "As for that ye call your God, it is a piece of bread. For a more proof thereof, let it lie in the box 3 months and it will be mouldy." It was a dangerous answer, a direct rejection of one of Catholicism's most sacred teachings. But Anne did not speak from rashness. Her words were deliberate, crafted to strip away what she saw as superstition and to affirm the supremacy of Scripture. Her writings also reveal her courage in the face of threats. When promised mercy, if she would name other reformers at court, she wrote, "I answered that I knew none." Even as the rack twisted her body, she refused to give them what they wanted. These writings, circulated secretly, turned her into more than a victim. They made her a voice, carried into the homes of English Protestants hungry for courage in the face of persecution. Anne's final trial took place in June 1546. She was brought into court not on her feet, but in a chair, her limbs dislocated, her body unable to support itself. The image shocked even some of her enemies, a young woman, wasted and pale, dragged before judges determined to see her die. But if her body was broken, her voice was not. When questioned once more on her beliefs, she refused to bend. She affirmed her faith in Scripture, rejected transubstantiation, and denounced the worship of the Mass. The court condemned her to burn. It was a sentence designed not only to kill, but to terrify. Burning was the punishment reserved for heretics, the most fearsome of deaths. Hanging was for thieves, beheading for nobles, but burning was for those whose very souls, the Church declared, were corrupt. Her fate was sealed, and yet, in condemning her, the court only strengthened her legend. On July 16, 1546, Anne was carried from the Tower to Smithfield, the great open marketplace in London that had long served as a stage for executions. Here, hundreds had been burned for heresy in the reigns of Henry VIII and Mary I. The smell of charred flesh, the sight of blackened stakes, lingered in the memory of the city. She was not alone. With her were three Protestant men, John Hadlam, Nicholas White, and John Lascelles. Together, they would face the flames. The scene was carefully arranged as theatre. A wooden stage was erected so that lords and ladies of the court could watch from comfort. The condemned were placed in chains bound to stakes, but Anne, unable to stand, was seated in a chair, her broken body tied upright. The symbolism was striking. Even crippled by torture, she would be paraded before the crowd, her suffering made part of the spectacle. As was custom, a sermon was preached before the execution. The preacher urged the crowd to see the condemned as examples of heresy's folly, warning that to stray from the Church was to invite damnation. But for many in the audience, it was Anne who commanded attention, not the sermon. Her youth, her noble birth, her calm amidst agony, all defied the narrative her captors wanted to impose. Some said she prayed quietly throughout. Others claimed she simply sat in silence, her gaze fixed on the heavens. Whatever the truth, her composure unsettled the spectacle. The fire was meant to humiliate. Instead, it risked turning her into a martyr. At last, the faggots were lit, smoke billowed, flames crackled, and heat surged upward. The men beside her screamed as the fire climbed their bodies, but Anne, bound in her chair, endured in silence. Some chroniclers claimed she never cried out at all, her body consumed in quiet defiance. Others said she spoke prayers to the end. What is certain is that her broken body was reduced to ash before the eyes of London. And with her death, the authorities believed they had silenced her forever, but they were wrong. Even as the ashes cooled, Anne's writings spread across England. Reformist networks circulated her words, framing her as a Protestant martyr. Her story appeared in John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, published decades later, where she was celebrated as one of the most heroic women of the English Reformation. Foxe described her as a woman of singular courage, ready to suffer for her faith, her burning a victory rather than a defeat. For Protestants, she became a saint of conscience, her death proof that God's truth could not be destroyed by fire. Legacy written in ashes. The flames of Smithfield consumed Anne Askew's body, but they could not consume her story. Indeed, her death ignited something larger than the authorities ever intended. What they sought to crush became immortalized in ink and memory. Her name was carried across England and into posterity, a testament to the dangerous power of one woman's defiance. Anne's greatest legacy lay in her writings. Her examinations, preserved and published after her death, were unlike anything the English Reformation had seen. Most accounts of martyrs came second-hand, filtered through chroniclers or court scribes. But Anne's words were her own. Her wit, her courage, her refusal to submit, all live in the lines she penned in prison. John Bale, the Protestant polemicist, was among the first to circulate her writings. Later, John Foxe enshrined her in his monumental Acts and Monuments, better known as the Book of Martyrs. In Foxe's pages, Anne Askew stands shoulder to shoulder with the great heroes of Protestantism. He portrayed her as calm, learned, and unshakable, contrasting her dignity with the cruelty of her captors. The book became a staple of English households, read by families for generations. Children grew up hearing Anne's story at the fireside, her example held up as the model of Protestant courage. Even long after the fires of Smithfield died, her words kept burning in the English imagination. Anne's death came at a turning point in English history. Within a year, King Henry VIII himself was dead, and the crown passed to his son Edward VI, under whom Protestantism flourished openly. The fires of Smithfield dimmed for a time, only to blaze again under Queen Mary I, when hundreds of Protestants were burned. Yet Anne Askew's name stood out even among the long roll of martyrs. She was invoked in sermons, remembered in ballads, and held up as proof that the true church was not Rome's but Christ's. Her execution, meant to reinforce Catholic authority, instead helped to erode it. When Elizabeth I came to the throne in 1558 and restored Protestantism, Anne was celebrated as one of the heroines whose blood had purchased England's religious future. The queen who ruled in triumph was, in part, legitimized by the memory of the woman who had died in agony. In Lincolnshire, plaques commemorate her birth. In London, Smithfield bears her ghost. That open square where fires once roared now hums with traffic, yet beneath its stones lie the echoes of her screams and her silence. Her words, preserved across centuries, still cut through the noise of history. This I say, that I had rather to die than to break my faith. It is a line that captures her essence, a woman who chose death over betrayal, truth over compromise, fire over silence. In the end, Anne Askew's execution was not merely the death of one woman. It was a revelation of the power of belief, the cruelty of power, and the resilience of the human spirit. And so, when we ask what became of Anne Askew, the answer is simple and profound. She died in fire, but she lived in history.